Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a completely fascinating, almost forensic approach to a very, very old word. We're going to deconstruct the ancient concept of riba. But here's the catch. We aren't treating it as a rigid religious rule or some simple moral failing. Nope. We're treating it as a clinical, universal law of economic physics. I want you to imagine looking at our global financial systems through this cold, high-contrast lens, essentially auditing the raw mechanics of how wealth moves, or, how it completely fails to move.
Okay, so here is our diagnostic checklist for today. We're starting with the atomic blueprint, moving into the anatomy of swelling, then we'll audit the real-world symptoms, ground the whole thing in the extractive dam, and finally look at erasure and generative growth.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the atomic blueprint. Time to deconstruct the roots.
We're starting our microscopic audit by stripping the term riba completely bare. Forget centuries of sectarian definitions for a second. We are looking strictly at the structural blueprint. Imagine these ancient Arabic root letters, ra, ba, alif, physically assembling themselves like architectural building blocks. Together, they actually form a fundamental equation of unbalanced expansion.
Notice how these three variables combine to create a really precise mechanical phenomenon. First up, we've got Ra, which represents the observation process, tracking measurable metrics, empirical data. Next is Ba, the local contact point. Think of containment or a physical local presence. And finally, Aleph, the primary vector, representing the absolute vertical baseline standard. When you synthesize these together, Riba isn't just a word anymore. It's a systemic equation. It literally describes a measurable metric being applied to a localized pocket, causing that specific area to accumulate mass, extending wildly away from the baseline standard of real-world value.
So let's see how that equation plays out in Section 2, the anatomy of swelling. Or as I like to call it, the law of parasitical growth. This is where the entire paradigm shifts. The traditional cultural narrative usually limits this concept to just a religious rule or ancient finance. But functionally, systemically, it's a universal law of economic physics. It's a destructive economic loop that operates exactly like a malignant tumor inside a biological organism. So we're essentially replacing the traditional translation of usury with this highly clinical understanding of parasitical extraction.
At its core, this root denotes artificial inflation. It's an accumulation extending away from the baseline, swelling up without producing any true physical wealth. Picture a microscopic, hyper-detailed macro shot of yeast rising rapidly. It describes a scenario where a localized metric swells completely out of proportion with the real-world baseline. It is, quite literally, an economic cancer. It grows purely through time and debt without actually adding any tangible, physical products or utility back to society.
Which brings us nicely to Section 3, auditing the symptoms. Let's look at the forensic evidence across different systems. To really verify this clinical definition, the source material conducts an audit of the text's internal cross-references. Like a solid forensic report, we observe this exact linguistic root describing symptoms across completely different systems just to prove its consistency. We see it in biology, describing the natural swelling of the earth when vegetation expands from water energy. We see it in physics, describing the flotation of empty foam, and we even see it in geopolitics, describing the illusion of national growth, tracking systemic power imbalances, where one nation swells its resource base by exploiting and draining another. It's perfectly consistent. And notice the specific mention of swelling, floating foam. It is such a perfect visual for wealth that lacks real substance. Think of a massive sea of bubbling foam expanding on the surface of a liquid, an inflation that looks incredibly huge on the outside, but internally, it's totally hollow. It's completely useless and destined by the strict laws of physics to just evaporate from the system. That is exactly how the text diagnoses artificial asset inflation.
Okay, Section 4, the extractive dam, grounding the theory. Let's take this high-level structural concept and apply it to a devastating practical metaphor. Let's step out of the cold, clinical mechanics for a second and shift into a warm, generative environment. A healthy economy, referred to here as sadakat, acts like a massive reservoir of fresh water up on a hill. Imagine those warm, golden rays of light hitting the water as it naturally flows down through channels to every single family's garden. Vegetables grow, food is produced, everyone eats. It's the fair, natural circulation of resources, built entirely on real trade and human effort. But then, the destructive loop kicks in. Watch how this unfolds. Step 1. A greedy landlord comes in and builds a massive, brutalist stone dam around that public water reservoir.
Step 2. He blocks the natural flow and demands a 2-bucket debt for a single bucket of water today. Step 3. Over the next few months, the landlord's private swimming pools and tanks swell artificially. They're just overflowing with promised water. On paper, he looks incredibly wealthy. But step 4? Down in the village valley, there's no real water naturally circulating. The ground turns to absolute dust, the families starve, and the entire economic life of the town shuts down and crashes completely.
And that right there is the exact mechanism of riba. Artificial asset inflation. Wealth increasing purely through time and debt extraction, offering absolutely zero societal utility. It's literally money breeding more money out of debt. It functions exactly like that malignant tumor we talked about earlier, aggressively absorbing all the localized nutrients until the host body, which is the society itself, suffers total systemic failure. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, erasure and generative growth. The automatic correction. So let's look at the system's automatic correction protocol, which is engineered into the universe itself. Check out this quote from Surah al-Baqarah. The primary source completely erases artificial asset inflation and causes generative distribution to expand. The mandate is super clear here. Hollow wealth, an economy that's just flooded with fake money lacking real work, undergoes a kind of digital disintegration. You just cannot cheat the laws of economics. As prices skyrocket and debts become totally unpayable, the fake financial system crashes and evaporates into thin air. Let's put these two states side by side. On one side, you have Riba, artificial, evaporating, hollow, extractive, and incredibly cold. On the other, sadakat, generative, circulating, real, and warm. As the cold, extractive structures mathematically crumble and digitally disintegrate before us, we are left only with the solid, grounded foundations of real trade. This represents permanent structural stability. It's where shared wealth, fair investment, and real projects can actually thrive without the parasitic drag of debt traps. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I'm gonna leave you with a pretty brutal question to chew on. Is our current global economy actually built on a generative primary baseline, or is it just swelling foam waiting to evaporate? It's a highly provocative lens to view our modern financial systems through, right? Because the universe, as it turns out, just doesn't tolerate economic monopolies. True progress only happens when those extractive dams are smashed and resources are allowed to circulate honestly. Thank you so much for diving into this systemic audit with me. Keep questioning the structures around you, and I'll catch you next time.